I walked into Hearthline Audio expecting a private listening salon, and found my own exit printed on cream paper. The announcement sat in the center of the oak table, my name tucked under a paragraph I had never approved, promising I would step back from the studio for my emotional well-being. Miles stood beside it with his hands folded like a man offering mercy before rearranging my life. Ivy Rourke sat in my usual chair, red pen in hand, smoothing one sentence so it sounded grateful. Nobody moved, because the room seemed to understand what they had done before I did. The speakers still hummed from the sample track, a woman's voice describing the house she left after 40 years. I looked from the paper to Miles, then to Ivy's pen resting near the line that said Hearthline would be safe in steadier hands. Who gave you permission to write in my voice? I kept my voice low, because the page already looked ugly enough without noise. Miles gave me the soft husband face he used whenever a room needed to believe he was kind. Brenna, this protects you, he murmured, glancing at Ivy as if she were there to witness his patience. People know you've been under pressure, and if we frame it gently, nobody has to ask harder questions. Ivy did not look ashamed. She lifted the page and replaced leaving with resting, like she had been hired to make my disappearance easier. That was when I saw the note in the margin. Small and tilted in Ivy's handwriting, keep Brenna looking thankful. My throat tightened. Not because Miles wanted out of the marriage, but because they had built a public version of me that would bow while they entered. I folded the announcement once and slid it into my bag without giving either of them the scene they had prepared. Miles reached for my wrist, but I stepped back and looked at the unsigned line under my name. Understanding the first proof had been handed to me by the woman who thought my signature was ceremonial. I had brought Ivy Rourke into Hearthline because she knew how to listen before she knew how to sell. Back then, she sat at the far end of our studio table with a legal pad, copying the way I spoke to donors who needed facts, archivists who needed respect, and families who needed proof their private grief would not become entertainment. I taught her where to soften a phrase, where to stop before a story became too polished, and how to say no without making the person across from her feel discarded. Now she had used every lesson to build a cleaner version of my removal. Miles kept talking while I stood with the folded announcement in my bag, his voice careful enough to sound rehearsed and tired enough to sound noble. This is just stability. Brenna, he murmured, one hand near the table but not touching the paper anymore. The studio needs one calm message before people start asking what changed at home. Ivy glanced down at her iPad, and the screen lit before she could turn it over, showing a message from Trent asking if the transition language was ready for partner review. That one line changed the temperature of the room more than any confession could have. Trent was not a friend, not a sponsor, not anyone who should have seen language about my role before I did. He ran Northlake Media, the kind of platform that bought tired little studios, polished their libraries, and sold the soul back as subscription content. I looked at Ivy, and she finally looked away, not like a woman ashamed of an affair, but like a strategist annoyed that a tab had been left open. I left before either of them could turn the message into something harmless. In the hallway, the carpet swallowed the sound of my steps, and my own studio suddenly felt like a place where people had practiced my absence. I called Dana Bellamy from the stairwell because elevators felt too small for what I had just learned. And when she heard my voice, she did not ask whether I was okay. "Do you still have the paper?" she asked. And I looked at the folded announcement in my bag, Ivy's little note pressed inside like a fingerprint. "I have the paper," I answered, "and I have her handwriting." Dana Bellamy's office sat above a pharmacy in Northwest Portland. Plain enough, nobody would imagine a marriage could walk in broken and come out organized. She did not ask me to describe Miles's face, Ivy's tone, or the years I had spent teaching them where my soft places were. She opened the folded announcement beside Ivy's margin note, then laid 3 contracts across her desk. "Good," she said, touching the unsigned line under my name. "They wrote the problem down, Miles's agreement came first, and Dana read it without drama. He was director of partnerships, not founder, not creative lead, and not authorized to move me out of my public role because my private life had become inconvenient. Ivy's consulting contract was shorter, but it carried the words that mattered: confidentiality, conflict of interest, and no authority to present herself as Hearthline's representative without written approval. "You don't have to prove they hurt you," Dana said, sliding the page over. "You only have to prove they used access they were never given." I stared at the clauses until they stopped looking like legal language and started feeling like floorboards under my feet. I wanted to say my husband had brought another woman into rooms where families trusted me with grief, shame, and truth they could barely speak once. Instead, I asked the only question that could survive the room. What if they say I'm reacting because the marriage is over? Dana looked at Ivy's handwriting in the margin. "Then we don't argue about the marriage. We argue about authority, client materials, brand access, and a third party seeing transition language before the founder did." That was the first moment my grief stopped leading. The paper did not care whether I had cried in my car or slept badly for a month. It cared that Miles had tried to speak for a company he did not own, and Ivy had helped shape a message she had no right to touch. I left with copies, not comfort, and that felt steadier. The listening night was half full when I arrived at the Heathman, with donors holding coffee cups and library directors leaning toward the sample track. Miles had chosen the room because it looked gentle, warm lamps and rugs, a place where people lowered their voices before knowing why. He thought I would protect the evening, read the announcement, and let Ivy become the calm face of the problem they had created. Ivy stood by the table in a cream blazer, smiling at people who knew my work, but not what she had tried to borrow. I did not read their paper. When the track faded, I thanked everyone for coming and told them Hearthline was reviewing public materials, speaker permissions, and representative authority before any new partnership language moved forward. The room stayed polite, because Portland rooms can make discomfort sound like silverware touching porcelain. Then Miles caught my elbow near the hallway and lowered his voice until it almost sounded loving. "You're making this harder, Brenna," he breathed, while Ivy stepped beside him and added, "You can't hold a studio together with feelings." I looked at Ivy first, because she had said the sentence like she had saved it. From my folder, I pulled the page Dana had marked from Ivy's consulting agreement and turned it so she could read the clause about written approval before representing Hearthline in any creative or partnership capacity. Her mouth parted, but no answer came, and for the first time since I found that announcement, she looked at paper instead of through me. Miles glanced toward the main room, where two donors checked their phones, and I knew the evening had shifted without anyone needing a scene. By dessert, 3 partners had asked my assistant to confirm who could sign on Hearthline's behalf. One library director squeezed my hand and said she would wait for my office before moving anything forward. Miles received the access review notice on his phone while standing 10 feet from Ivy, and the color left his face. I went back into the room, listened to the next story play, and let the company breathe without his hand on its throat. The next morning, nothing at Hearthline crashed. It simply stopped recognizing the people who had mistaken access for ownership. Miles's account moved into review, his shared folders locked, and the partnership inbox he loved to treat like a private gate no longer opened under his password. Dana's letter went out before lunch. Clean and specific. Naming, overreach, conflict of interest, and unauthorized transition language without mentioning the woman he had chosen over me. I signed the employment notice with my hand steadier than I felt. Miles was placed on suspension pending final review, and by late afternoon, the cause was plain enough that even his charm had nowhere to land. Ivy's contract ended the same way, with a cease and desist covering Hearthline materials, unpublished series language, and any portfolio page that made my work look like her strategy. There was no door slamming, no public scene, only a series of permissions returning to the person who had earned them. Miles called from the parking garage, his voice low and wounded in the way he used when he wanted guilt to sound like love. "You're turning a marriage problem into a war," he said, and I looked at the signed notice beside my coffee, still warm from the hand I had pressed against it. "No, Miles. You use the studio first. I'm taking it back out of your hands." For a moment, he breathed into the line like silence might still work on me. Then the call ended before he could make himself the victim again. Ivy's message arrived after sunset, sharp enough to hide the panic under it. She wrote that I had lifted her up just to let her fall, and I read it beside the margin note, where she had told Miles to keep me looking thankful. That small instruction made her complaint feel smaller than she wanted it to be. Before I could answer, Russell Keene called, not to ask if I was all right, but to warn me that sponsors were nervous and wanted the studio to sound stable by morning. That was the part that finally made me laugh without warmth back. By the next afternoon, Miles had found a man who loved wounded companies more than healthy ones. Trent Ashford ran Northlake Media, and in audio. His name usually arrived right before a studio lost its name and called the loss scale. He did not need Miles to be right, only angry enough to talk. Miles gave him partner lists, guessed at sponsor anxiety, and sold the idea that Hearthline was cheap because the woman who built it had become inconvenient. I heard about it from Dana before Russell called me again. 2 trade newsletters had started using the same careful language, calling Hearthline's leadership uncertain and its founder distracted, words that looked polite until sponsors read them twice. Ivy tried to make her entrance through Trent, pitching herself as the person who understood my voice, my audience, and the softer way to repackage my catalog. Trent listened long enough to learn she had nothing clean to offer, then treated her like proof that Miles was desperate. Russell wanted calm in the way nervous men often want it, by asking the woman in the fire to step out first. He told me partners needed reassurance, maybe even an interim voice, someone neutral enough to make Hearthline feel less personal while the noise settled. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, looking at the cease and desist Dana had sent Ivy and the access notice Miles had received. "You want me to disappear so the room feels easier," I said, and Russell exhaled like I had made it impolite. That evening, Dana came by with a folder thick enough to change the air between us. Inside were confirmation letters from the Library Consortium, university archives, and the education platform we had been quietly negotiating with before Miles ever tried to make me look tired. The agreement was close, clean, and built around creator consent, not bargain bin panic. Dana tapped the stack once and said, "They are trying to price the studio before they know what you kept safe." For the first time all day, I smiled. The meeting was held in Hearthline's main room, with Russell at one end of the table and Trent Ashford sitting as if the place had agreed to belong to him. Library partners, archive directors, sponsors, and 2 trade reporters filled the chairs, their faces careful after articles calling my leadership uncertain. Trent laid out his offer first. Smooth, reasonable, promising Northlake could protect the catalog, stabilize the staff, and turn our stories into something scalable. He looked at me when he finished and said, "The market does not pay for feelings, Brenna." I let the room sit with that sentence, because it told everyone what he thought he was buying. Then I opened the folder Dana had carried in the night before and announced Hearthline Commons, a long-term distribution agreement with public library systems, university archives, and an education platform built around creator consent and protected rights. The catalog Trent wanted to price as distressed was now tied to clean permissions, new institutional reach, and partners who had waited for my signature, not Miles's explanation. "You are right," I told Trent, keeping my hand on the signed letters. "The market pays for clean rights, clean trust, and clean contracts." Miles understood before anyone said his name. His face went flat, because the information he had fed Northlake was old, and the studio he tried to sell cheap had changed value while he was busy proving he had never owned it. Ivy stood near the back wall, looking at the letters on the table like they were written in a language she had not managed to copy. She had learned my cadence, my donor phrases, even how I thanked people before saying no. But she had never learned why people trusted me. Russell rose, shame working through his careful voice. He confirmed the advisory board supported me as founder-director, and the room accepted it because the proof was sitting in front of them. Trent closed his folder without another offer, and paper against leather sounded louder than his entrance had been. By the time the meeting ended, nobody needed the details of my marriage. They only needed to know who had brought risk and who had brought value. The divorce papers did not make a sound when I signed them, which felt right after everything else had been so carefully loud. Miles lost Northlake the moment Trent understood his map of Hearthline was outdated. And after that, the industry stopped treating him like a founder with a grievance. He was just a former partnerships director who had tried to sell access he no longer had. People did not say much to me about him, but they stopped asking him to explain anything. Ivy's fall was quieter, and that made it harder for her to turn into sympathy. Her consulting contract was gone. Her portfolio pages were scrubbed of Hearthline language, and every serious interview came back to the same cease and desist she could not explain, without naming what she had done. Trent's offer became a joke told carefully over conference coffee, the kind of joke professionals make when they want everyone to know a man misread the room. Russell sent me an apology. Not polished. Not public. Only one plain paragraph admitting he had confused stability with asking me to step away from what I built. After the papers were filed, I stopped listening for damage. I walked along the Willamette in the mornings, had dinner with Dana without checking my phone under the table, and recorded new stories in a studio that finally sounded clean again. There were still bad nights, because peace does not erase what happened. It just stops letting it lead every room. One evening, while a narrator read a line about coming home to yourself, I realized I was no longer waiting for Miles to understand the woman he had underestimated. I had become too steady to need that from him. If this story found a quiet place in you, tell me which moment felt the most familiar. Sometimes peace does not arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes when you stop begging people to value what they kept using. Stay. Breathe. And remember, your life can still sound like your own again.